Anna and I are here to talk about realizing the value of data management from the laboratory side. So what that means is yesterday there was quite a bit of really excellent conversation, I thought, about kind of how to share data and why to share data. What we're really here to talk about is data management and data sharing in practice. And we come to this conversation both as researchers ourselves, both Anna and I are cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience researchers by training, but we now work on education and infrastructure related to those things. So we wear multiple hats and come to this from multiple perspectives, both as researchers and as kind of service providers and sources of expertise for researchers. So I think a good way of starting the conversation about our perspective and value of data management and data sharing and kind of the complexities of those things is to start with an example. So we're both cognitive science people by training, so this is a very cognitive science oriented example. So let's just imagine a very straightforward experiment in that domain where a participant, a human participant, is sat in front of a computer and asked to press a button in response to things that appear on the screen. Relatively simple looking design, something that if you've ever been a psychology undergraduate student at a research-focused university, you've probably participated in an experiment just like this. But as simple as that looks, there are quite a few research objects associated with even this kind of simple appearing experiment. So we have software tools that are needed to present things to the participant and record their responses. We have similarly software tools to run stats. We have a huge array of output files that are created based on what responses participants are putting in. Hopefully all of the documentation, there's all kinds of documentation of data collection procedures, data analysis decisions, things like data dictionaries and code books describing the contents of data files. And of course we have digital materials, but also non-digital items, including consent forms and, questionnaires, potentially that kind of thing. And so there's a huge array of research objects. And if you were to ask, half a dozen researchers to point to what they consider their data or the data needed to reproduce or replicate their experiment, you might have some different answers. So as I kind of highlighted at the bottom here, all of these materials need to be properly managed, but questions about what needs to be shared to give the kind of reproducibility and advantages that we've been talking about at the workshop so far is kind of a little bit of an open question. So as people who work with researchers and try to impart kind of best practices related to data management and data sharing, what do we actually talk about? So it's a huge array of things, actually. I've listed just a couple of them on this slide here. Generally, they fall into categories related to organizing, documenting, storing, and sharing data files and associated materials. But you can see that there's quite a lot of different kind of specific things to touch on. And sort of by default, because of that, what ends up happening is we end up talking at a very high level. So I teach a data management workshop that's 90 minutes that covers all of this. And I can't get into a lot of detail about an individual researcher's data management needs as I do that. Of course, I follow up my workshops with a promise of a more detailed consultation to follow. But sometimes the level that I can describe these things is not what the researcher needs in that moment. And as we have these conversations with researchers, as we are talking to them about how to manage data, how to share data, something that has come up a lot is that researchers are often missing important context related to why we are stating the importance of certain things. So I've again listed some specific examples on this page or on this slide, but without proper context, it's often hard to communicate the importance of something like a digital object identifier or an ORCID ID, or what the difference between working storage as they're working with data and archival storage means. And these specific examples I think are interesting, but really the point I'm trying to make here is kind of a rhetorical question. Should every researcher be an expert in data management and data sharing? And I will answer my own rhetorical question in saying, well, maybe not an expert. I mean, there's sources of expertise. There's data librarians, there's other stakeholders that are on this call and watching this call. But we do need to find a way to communicate to researchers and work with researchers so that they know and can get across the material that they need to do. And so this is how I end up framing things for researchers. I end up asking questions very close to their immediate interests. So if you see these questions, the first of which is, if another researcher were to ask for a copy of your data, data described in one of your papers, would you be able to easily find it and send it to them? You can see from these questions that we're not mentioning terms like fair data. I'm not mentioning terms like, even preservation. I'm trying to, as much as I can, put things in terms that not only can researchers understand, but are immediately kind of within something that they appreciate, kind of within what their research workflow. And really, from there, if I can establish why they think this data management and data sharing things are important, there's a variety of directions which we can go. So we can talk about data management and data sharing as improving data quality and security and research and efficiency. We can talk about data sharing in terms of citations. We can talk about it in terms of requirements. So there's a variety of directions to go from that initial kind of conversation. But Anna and I are researchers by training, like I mentioned, and we have tried to take a more, if not systematic, at least organized approach to understanding researcher needs. So we've conducted a couple of studies, one into neuroimaging research and one into psychology research, to identify what researchers are currently doing as a way to inform kind of the education and outreach and infrastructure that we are involved in. And these are quite lengthy studies. I think the neuroscience or the neuroimaging one was like 75 questions, so very long. And including questions related to data management, including use of specific tools and specific practices, but also emerging practices such as preprints and things like that. And so I won't spend a huge amount of time going over our results, but in general, across the two studies that we've done so far, researchers generally think that they are doing pretty well as individuals. And they often are. So researchers are organizing data so they themselves can find it in sort of the immediate short term, and they're backing up data. But there is often little consistency across lab groups, even within lab groups. So members of the same lab might have very different practices from one another. And we also asked about what is motivating, what is currently motivating, what is currently limiting how they are managing and sharing data. And these are more or less in order, similarly across the two studies. And you can see that the motivations from data management are very immediate, actually. People are managing data in the way that they are because they don't want to lose data. They want to ensure access for their collaborators. Openness and reproducibility is on the list, certainly, but it is secondary to these things. And then in terms of limitations, a limitation that we have not talked about, I don't think too much, is time. So researchers are saying that they do not organize and manage their data in the way that we might want them to because it takes a lot of time. And then another factor is a lack of best practices, meaning that their research area has not specified exactly what they should do, which actually mirrors our own experience, where oftentimes a researcher will say, what exactly do I need to do? What exactly should be the format of a data dictionary or a code book, or how exactly should I organize my files? And the financial cost is certainly a factor, but it is, at least so far in our research, kind of secondary to these other things. And I think at this point, I will transfer it over to Anna.
Thank you, John. So if you could go to the next slide for me. Right, so coming from that background of having surveyed researchers, from working with researchers from the perspectives of libraries and from data repositories, we've come to find that there's still several missing pieces to having good data management and sharing practices be more widely universal. And the first of those that has been touched on numerous times yesterday was education, that data management is rarely taught as a formal skill to graduate students and trainees, and that making this training more a standard part of scientific or research training is really important to give people the confidence and background in not just what to do, but why are you doing it? So some labs may have quite good data management protocols that get passed on to trainees. This is the way the lab works. But it may be that even though researchers apply those practices, they don't understand the rationale for why those practices exist or why things are done in a certain way, which can make it quite hard when they go to start their own research groups to understand what practices to put in place there. And I think we can see that this exists not just from researchers' practices, but also from looking studies that have looked at data management plans to assess them for quality, and seeing that there's quite a wide range of knowledge and that standardizing this may be helpful. The other thing is that researchers may not be in contact with other data management stakeholders who could assist them, whether this is librarians or repositories or other tools and resources. And so it's important to pass along that knowledge. Another missing piece is clearly, still on the last one, is clearly the lack of established best practices. And one thing to note here is that sometimes practices or standards may have been created in a discipline, and so they are technically established, but they're not widespread in use enough yet that researchers understand easily how to apply them to their research. So I think in creating standards, we have to think about not just creating them, but then also doing the outreach to get them widely distributed in a field. And another point of confusion for researchers may be the many different standards that exist. For those of us in the standards space, it may feel that there are many great options, but these many great options, especially when looking at both general standards, such as maybe the FAIR principles, and as well as other discipline-specific standards, may actually add to the confusion for researchers in knowing what is the best practice for what they're trying to do. Next slide, please. Then the other pieces that we found, other points of confusion, are some things that areas where outreach may be beneficial. One is certainly the support for data management costs, not just whether these are allowable under certain grants, but how they can be accommodated within the grant budgets that researchers are working with. And similarly, this may apply for both storage. Researchers actually often think about storage a lot, we found, but it's often in the context of security and operational data and not about long-term preservation and data deposit, as well as the time, effort, and funding resources needed for curation and documentation. And then, of course, we've touched on the incentives and rewards. So making sure that data sharing and data management and sharing efforts are valued by people who are doing hiring, promotion, that these are being taken into account by funders and publishers. And thinking about how these translate into the day-to-day for researchers so that they know whether dedicating time to these efforts is worthwhile, because that is really one of the main sticking points, is just the time and effort that these take. Next slide, please. But of course, we've seen great growth already. So this is a plot of showing data that's been deposited in generalist repositories that's been cited in publications based on DOIs. And so this is showing from 2012 to 2020, there's been already a 5 or 10-fold increase in data being cited in publications. And you would expect this to continue to grow quite steeply over the next 5 years. So as data sharing becomes more common, researchers will by default become more familiar with these practices. And what we have to think about as a community is how much do they need to know and how can we support them as a community to make things as interoperable and low barrier as possible. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the question that we were specifically asked to address, which was a perception of data sharing value. And one thing we have to say is this is honestly quite hard to answer with a qualitative answer. It's simply not well researched, but from our perspective, we've seen a few different things. So one is that data sharing value depends still very much on the specific disciplinary community that someone is working in. Another thing is that it can be quite project specific. So some projects are created with the goal of designing an open data set or tool, specifically with the idea that it will be broadly distributed and broadly reused. And that informs the whole data management plan for that project and the effort dedicated to it, which can be quite different from a research project where someone is just asked to share at the end of the project for the sake of transparency. Also, an understanding of what data reuse means may be different to researchers from other stakeholders. This was recently demonstrated in a new paper by Imker and colleagues that researchers may not think, they may think of data reuse as simply taking values out of tables in a paper, or they may not see the value of someone else reusing their data from a publication. So getting on the same page, understanding what that means. But there is growing recognition of open science in general. Next slide. And of course, all of this perception of value hinges on many outside stakeholders as well. So of course, there's outside influences for researchers, such as their institutions, funders, and publishers, what impact they can demonstrate. So can they use data citations to demonstrate an impact? How can these be incorporated, say, into grant reports and proposals? And how can we begin to track that better as a community? I think we're still at the very early stages of seeing open data and its impact, because the citation timeline for reuse of data especially can be quite long for someone to find the data, aggregate it, or reuse it in a new result. But I'm looking forward to that becoming more common and impact being more easily demonstrated in the future. Next slide. So that takes us to just a few takeaway points we wanted to leave you with. The first is that data management and sharing practices do not seem to be fully established across all disciplines yet, and that in general, researchers seem willing and eager for more training, more support. There's a lot of value in data management and sharing, and researchers are seeing this. But there may be many different perspectives on this value and what it means in terms of dedicating time and resources to this effort. And then lastly, as a community of data management stakeholders gathered here today and in many other forums, we can do a lot to help clarify what the practices can be, set standards, set expectations, and help create incentives for these data management and sharing practices. And next slide. So thank you very much. Thank you again to the organizers for the invitation to speak. We look forward to the discussion, and you're welcome to get in touch with either John or me by email. Thank you.